Good morning, brothers and sisters in Christ, and welcome to this Holy Week, which began yesterday with Palm Sunday and is a deep reflection in the church year on the passion and death of Jesus and the celebration of his resurrection, leading to his celebration on Sunday. And during this time, in the daily morning and evening prayer lessons, there is we sort of step outside of our normal pattern where we follow, at least in the Old Testament, where we follow one particular book and move through it. And we take, during this week, just selected passages throughout the Old Testament that are prophetic about Christ's, about the coming, the need for the Messiah and the suffering Messiah as we understand him to be. And so they're typological readings, Christological, and we try to see the connections between why this is prophetic, why it is typological. This morning our reading is from Lamentations, written by the prophet Jeremiah, and in the few weeks after the destruction of Jerusalem. And just a short history to make some sense of where we are in the Bible when we're reading this passage in history. You know that the people of Israel are brought out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, and that establishing of the nation of Israel takes time. It's only under King David that it begins to be more settled and centered around Jerusalem, and then under Solomon, it's the extent of its reach. Politically, it's established these 12 tribes united under Solomon. On his death, Solomon has an unwise son who is too severe, and there is a breaking apart of that unity. And you have 10 of the northern tribes out of the 12 forming what is called Israel, and the 2 southern tribes forming what is called Judah and centered around Jerusalem. After a couple of centuries, and there's sort of tension between these 2 kingdoms. In the around 720 or so, the Assyrians come in and invade after much warnings from prophets, like Isaiah. There's a warning about changing their ways, and they don't. And the Assyrians take over that place, the northern kingdom, and it falls. There's a mix of Jewish and Assyrians in this northern kingdom. It's never seen by the southern kingdom as kind of pure, and that tradition continues even to the time of the Samaritans in the New Testament, where they're seen as kind of impure or not quite real Jews or pure Jews. The southern kingdom is what we are now looking at, and it fell under the Babylonians in 587 BC. And in the reading this morning from Lamentations, chapter 1, verses 1 to 12, you hear this, the cry of utter destruction of the city. God had warned the people many times, and they had not listened, and finally Babylon comes and destroys and destroys the temple even. And you hear of this deep sorrow, utter devastation in the heart of Jeremiah, the result of his prophesying has not resulted in a change in heart of the people of Israel. We hear echoes of a kind of destruction of Christ in this reading. All her enemies have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Or in verse 7, when her people fell into the hands of the foe, and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. And we can just hear what's happened. Yesterday we heard in the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, those very same people began to mock him only a few days later. There is a parallel between Israel and Jesus the Messiah. Israel was to be the one through whom all nations were to be blessed, the promise through Abraham. And they are a blessing they are given the gift of the law, which is an expression of what is true about how to love one another and order one's life. In terms of the moral law, it's eternal, and that gift is being shared around the world. And we see today that through Israel and through the church, that law has gone to the ends of the earth. And they also were the one to give forth our birth to the Messiah, this gift to the whole world. And Jesus is the one, through whom the whole world is to be saved. But Israel cannot be that blessing itself as a nation so long as she has turned herself away from God. And this is the lamentation of Jeremiah. He was crying out to them, change your ways, show justice, follow the commandments, have a society that reflects God's kingdom, or else there will be destruction. In verse 12, we read the sorrow of Jeremiah. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. And it's often we think about, well, sometimes people make this sort of trite sort of description that the God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath and the God of the New Testament is one of love. And that's really not a very deep looking at the scriptures. We see both deep love being expressed in the Old Testament, and we see the wrath of God and the warnings by Jesus as well about the wrath to those who continue in their ways, contrary to God. The fierce God is not changing, and he is eternally and perfectly love. And when we hear descriptions of the fierce anger of God, it's one expression of his burning love. If you can think of this in terms of when a child is running out onto the street and a parent sees it and can't get to the child in time, he screams at the child or she, stop, and in a kind of, it sounds like an anger, and it terrifies the child, and the child stops in his tracks. But that's meant to be, that is an expression of pure love for the child, that it might not be hurt by the traffic that's coming by. So God doesn't allow the Babylonians to come in without any warning beforehand, calling on them to change their ways, calling on them to turn to him and to know what life and love is. And if he cannot awaken his people through the prophets, then he needs to remove that boundary that he has around them to protect them, and to allow this exile, this invading nation to come in and to take them away, to awaken them. Because more important than them having peace in their land and sufficient material prosperity, more important than that is that their souls are right with him, that they are actually reconnecting with their true purpose of knowing God and of sharing his love with the world. Exile was the only means by which they could be awakened. And this is the sorrow of the situation that's happened here. We know just a little bit of, perhaps in our small way, during our exile in this coronavirus situation, where things are taken away from us that perhaps we've just taken for granted. The ability to come to church on Sundays is so easy, and maybe I'm not feeling like going that day or whatever. It's not so important now that it's taken away from us. We recognize how much we appreciate being together, even more than we did when it was a regular thing, and So that's just an example of that in a minor way. On another level, we can, Plato has spoken about in the Republic, the soul is like the city, and this is not unusual in biblical ways of thinking as well, that we compare a nation with an individual, with Israel with the soul. In the book of the Song of Songs, it's been understood to be a kind of a love story between God and his people, or God and the soul. And we can think about what happens to us individually when we forget God and his warnings and his call to love, and we follow on a destructive path. Sometimes, well, the only solution can be in order to, not to, is to allow a person to go into that place where they are, where they find themselves in a state of devastation, experiencing something of the destructiveness of their destructive way, in order for them to turn around, to wake up to what is most important. So this lamentation that Jeremiah has for the city can also, we could see as a lamentation that that expresses something of our sorrow when we sin, when we tear ourselves away from the source of life, the source of joy. In this Holy Week, often one aspect of it is to reflect on our lives, to see ways in which we could be more faithful and draw closer to Christ, to put to death sin as we follow Jesus to the cross, and that we might rise with him in the resurrection. I wish you a blessed week and a blessed day.